Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event, Too Small to Fail. I'm Heather Bakken, President of the Canadian Club of Ottawa. While we're on a virtual platform right now, I would like to acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous peoples to the land each one of us is on. For the Canadian Club of Ottawa, it's the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin. Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of the territory where the Parliament buildings overlook the Ottawa River, which is just downstream from one of the most sacred places for Indigenous peoples, Miigwech. COVID-19 has had a devastating effect on small businesses in Canada. The pandemic has resulted in many of them being shuttered and others forced into survival mode, unsure whether or not they will be able to make it through the coming months. This is an untenable position. The impacts of the crisis have been felt more sharply by women who are overrepresented in small businesses across Canada. You will hear today from leaders of industry, government, and academia to discuss how small businesses are working through the crisis and what can be done to help them thrive in a post-pandemic economy. Before we introduce our speakers, however, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. If your internet quality is poor, please use the click here to switch stream button. It will reduce your audio, your video quality, but it should keep the audio the same using the same bandwidth. If you're having any other technical issues, please click on the request help button at the bottom right corner of the webcast page. A response to your issue will be sent to the email address you provided upon registration. To ask a question, there's going to be a Q&A following the panel discussion. Just click on the questions tab, type in your question and click submit. It will be sent to the email, you can do this at any point in the broadcast, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the panel discussion today. I'd also like to give a shout out and a note of gratitude to our corporate sponsors, without whom today's event would not be possible. Our corporate sponsors for the year are Shaw Communications and RBC Royal Bank. The gold sponsors are Welch LLP, Strategy Corp, and TD Bank. And the Canadian Club 2021 virtual season is partnered with Impact Public Affairs, iPolitics, the Ottawa Business Journal, and the Hill Times. And before I introduce our fabulous moderator, I would like to throw to a 13-second message from one of our media partners.
iPolitics is a proud sponsor of the Canadian Club Ottawa. If you enjoy policy issues and would like a daily dose of policy news, stay tuned for the virtual draw after the panel discussion to win a free subscription to iPolitics.
Thank you very much, Franca. Your moderator today is Heather Schofield. Almost goes without saying. She's the Ottawa Bureau Chief and economics columnist at the Toronto Star, Canada's largest circulation newspaper. Heather was previously the Bureau Chief at the Canadian Press. Prior to that, she worked at the Globe and Mail, where she covered economics, fiscal policy, and monetary policy for the Report on Business. These are just some of Heather's many accomplishments over her nearly 3-decade career in journalism, which has its underpinnings with a master's degree in journalism from Western University, or as we call it in the day, the University of Western Ontario. So go Western. Over to you, Heather.
Thanks, other Heather. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very interested in having this conversation today because I don't think there's been a point in my career where I've spent so much time thinking about small business and the role it plays in our society. I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago of listening into an MP's conversation. It was an Ask Me Anything session she had in downtown Toronto. And her constituents were calling in. I was taken with the story of one man who owned a tavern. It's been open in Toronto for 70 years, one of the oldest taverns in Toronto. And he was not actually asking for money. He was asking for help in trying to navigate through all the different rules and regulations and different supports out there and facing a stack of municipal infractions that were going to put him under. I was just so taken with the difficulties of trying to handle a crisis that like we've never seen before, and something that really is striking everybody very close to home, because we very quickly realized that these small businesses are really very much the fabric of our community. So to take us through this today, we'll start with we have Beatty, who of course is the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and he they have 200,000 members, many of whom are living this experience that I just mentioned. Perrin is a descendant of one of Canada's most prominent manufacturing families. He grew up in Fergus, Ontario, graduated from my alma mater as well, the University of Western Ontario, a little bit before I did in 1971. Perrin was first elected to the House of Commons as a progressive conservative in 1972, where he served, and he eventually went on to serve as minister in seven different portfolios. And then joined the private sector in the 1990s. He has served as president and chief executive officer of the CBC, and has been a prominent public intellectual, I guess I would say, since then. We will also be hearing from Dr. Wendy Sukier, who is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Management and the director of the Diversity Institute. Wendy is one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies, innovation processes, and diversity and inclusion, and has a whole bunch of very interesting ideas. She's about business of the future and the workforce of the future. She's received many awards for her work. She has an MA, an MBA, and a PhD in management science and 2 honorary doctorates. And we will be hearing also from John Stackhouse, Senior VP from the Office of the CEO at Royal Bank, my former boss, also national best-selling author and one of Canada's leading voices on innovation and economic disruption. He leads RBC's, the organization's research and thought leadership on economic, technological, and social change. And previously, he was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and editor of Report on Business. He's a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And his latest book is Planet Canada, How Our Expats Are Shaping the Future. And last but not least, we will be hearing from Paul Thompson, who's the Associate Deputy Minister at ISED, Innovation, Science and Economic Development. He was appointed there in November 2017. He's seen all corners of government. It held senior positions at the Privy Council Office, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Treasury Board. And right before he joined ISED, he was he held several senior positions at Employment and Social Development Canada. So to start us off, let's go first turn to, I guess, a pretty broad question. And we'll turn first to Perrin Beatty to take us, just to set the stage a little bit. We hear all over the place, we hear our leaders calling for Canadians to buy local, and we see many government supports announced, redesigned, and enhanced, but small businesses are still in trouble. There's not a main street left in Canada that isn't dotted with shuttered storefront windows. Can you tell us, what are the biggest challenges facing small and medium-sized businesses now as the second wave rages, despite all the supports that are out there?
The big challenge is survival, to put it in its simplest terms. Why is that? Well, we've seen everywhere in the world where COVID has come ashore, it's been small business that's been hit the most. Why? They don't have the same management resources that are available to larger businesses. They don't have cash reserves that larger businesses have, and they don't have the access to capital that larger businesses have. And particularly as we look at lockdowns taking place across Canada, what we've seen, we've partnered with Statistics Canada on the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. One of the things the latest survey shows is that small and medium-sized businesses have been twice as hard hit in terms of lockdowns in percentage terms than larger businesses have been. If you look at the retail sector in particular, many of them were closed for Black Friday, which was a major buying period. They aren't online in many instances. They can't compete. They miss out on that. We're going to the Christmas season, which is absolutely critical for small businesses, for retailers in particular. Many of them are shut down, or people are staying away as a result of social distancing requirements. I think what we're seeing is many businesses and restaurants and others hanging on through Christmas, possibly New Year, and we may see ourselves faced with a wave of closures as a result. So they need special attention. We have to help them get to the other side of the river.
So that gives us a little bit of an idea of the state of play right now. I want to turn to John Stackhouse about where we're heading. You're just coming out of some research that looks at where we've been and casts forward. You've said that the global financial crisis during that time, 10, 12 years ago, policymakers were worried about too big to fail. But here we are calling this conference, too small to fail. What do you think? What does that mean? And what does the current state of small business mean for our prospects for recovery?
Thanks, Heather. It's such an important question because this crisis should open our eyes to the transitions in the economy, which will continue even after the virus has faded. I think Perrin's just made a critical point that we may be facing a cliff, if you will, after New Year's for a lot of retailers, and need to be very mindful of that acute point in the calendar. Looking beyond that, we're concerned that there's a number of sectors, and we've got a new report out today called Navigating 2021. It's a series of 21 charts looking at the year ahead. One of them shows sector by sector the prospects as we see them in the year ahead. And the sectors that were hardest hit in 2020 are going to be the slowest to recover. So accommodation, retail, hospitality are going to have a real hard grind for the year ahead, even as the virus fades away. Those are exactly the firms that Perrin was speaking to that don't have the liquidity, the buffer to get through a number of quarters. This is critically different from the financial crisis of 10 plus years ago, which was largely a liquidity crisis between firms. Things like counterparty risk were heavy determinants of how things went because big firms froze and they weren't willing to trade with each other, to respect payments to each other or through the banking system. We managed our way through that. This is a very different crisis. That kind of wholesale liquidity, if you will, has been in pretty good shape thanks to the work of central banks and other authorities over the last year. But on the front lines, there's been a collapse of demand that is crippling to all businesses in different ways, but especially to smaller businesses that don't have the savings, they don't have the firm liquidity, not the system's liquidity, the firm liquidity to get from quarter to quarter. They may not have the inventories to manage. They don't have the margins as well. So when sales come back, they're not able to build up or restock their finances as well as some larger businesses did. So we need to be very mindful of this acute period that we're in. The next few weeks are going to be critical, but the next few quarters, even if the vaccines take effect, are going to be very challenging, especially for smaller businesses right through 2021. So we argue this in the report. We're going to need more targeted support for sectors and more supports for small businesses in areas like skills and trade that we can get into perhaps later in the conversation. But it's both a near-term cliff, if you will, and this longer grind of getting through the year ahead that's going to be a real challenge for smaller businesses.
Okay, thanks. So let's talk a little bit about those workforces and a question for Wendy Suk here. So, in the before times, the small businesses were already, I think we could say, at a disadvantage in preparing for the future of work for many reasons, limited human resources, the capacity to train up staff to prepare for a workforce that is sometimes very hard to envisage. But I think, the pandemic, we keep saying it changes everything. And it means almost, I think, that the future of work is basically now, that the technology and working from home has forced us into this new zone of thinking about digital work. How can small business, if they're already dealing with what John calls a collapse of demand and Perrin has taken us through some of these conditions, how can you deal with that and also prepare yourself for a completely different world of work that's facing us, or that's basically here on our doorstep?
Thanks very much for the question and for including me. So I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is historically Canada's skills agenda has been driven by large companies. And even though SMEs account for the majority of jobs in this country, they've been kind of shut out of the discussion around skills for quite some time. So I think that's one of the things that this has certainly done is made clear that we have to really be looking at small businesses as well. The other piece that hasn't been mentioned, which I think is really important to keep in mind, is everything that Perrin said about SMEs generally. Double if you're talking about women-led businesses, double if you're talking about businesses owned by Black Canadians. So that's the other thing, is even among small businesses, we see huge cleavages between those that are run by women and diverse groups, because they're even smaller, more poorly resourced, and more likely to be in those sectors that John mentioned are being decimated. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. The silver lining has been that some small SMEs pivoted very effectively. I mean, necessity was the mother of invention. They digitized. We just were part of a competition for women entrepreneurs, and some of the stories were amazing. People who had 6 outlets they were supplying before COVID now are in 60 across North America, because they realized once they went digital, they could go anywhere. And I do think that there is that opportunity if we can accelerate the pace of digitization. And part of that is sector specific. So there are some sectors, if you've got a restaurant, you can go online, but it's certainly not as easy as if you're in other domains. So it does have to be sector specific. But we know that prior to COVID, about 30% of SMEs in Ontario didn't even have an internet presence. And so COVID has really accelerated technology adoption. And I think, and Perrin will perhaps have a different view of this or more details, but I think that when we look at what the barriers are to going digital, to using some of the technologies that John has been, sort of at the forefront of looking at, part of it is access to infrastructure. If you're a small business in a rural community, you have fewer options, and that's why the investments of broadband, in my view, are absolutely fundamental. Part of it is affordability, although with a lot of the technology, that is not the biggest impediment. The biggest impediment is often skills and time, because if you're trying to survive, you don't actually have the time to explore what the options are. And so, for me, one of the best programs that has been rolled out is Digital Main Street, for example. And I love that program because not only does it provide small businesses with access to the human capital and the skills that they need to pivot quickly, but it creates opportunities for young people to work in SMEs. And a lot of the existing student work placements have not really penetrated the SME space. So I think there are really innovative ways that we can provide the support that SMEs need in the form that they need. And certainly making sure that we have, when we're designing programs as part of the skills and training agenda, we're not leaving small businesses behind, from my point of view, are absolutely fundamental. When we look at women-led businesses, it's not just the technology issues, it's often basic financial literacy. I mean, we're running big programs to help self-employed women understand the advantages of incorporation in terms of risk management, access to resources, navigation piece. As Perrin said, there are lots of programs out there. Figuring out which door to go through is often really, really difficult. And I think big players like the banks can really help with that navigation. So there's lots that can be done. There's no question we're in a very difficult time, but I think making sure that we keep SMEs, and especially those run by diverse people, front and center in the recovery plans, really important.
Hey, thanks. So let's turn to somebody who's got his hands in some of those support programs. So Paul Thompson, can you talk to us a bit about about the relationship between government and business and how the pandemic has changed that. I mean, we keep hearing about this very dynamic thing that happened in the spring and in the summer, where we had so many corporations piling into what was almost like a war effort to get Canada ready for, supplying domestically all the things that we needed to deal with the pandemic. Can you talk to us about small business in that process, and whether or not there's any kind of legacy that small business, that kind of symbiotic relationship between small business and government, whether it can continue?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Heather. Some great policy themes on the table that my colleagues have raised that are critically important: liquidity, skills, digital adoption, diversity. Those are all kind of the watchwords of the day from a policy perspective. But maybe just reflecting on the early experiences in the pandemic, which were actually quite positive. The response we got from businesses of all sizes across the country to the call for action that the Prime Minister put out in terms of production of PPE. We had over 6,500 companies that stepped up, and hundreds of them ended up pivoting their businesses pretty significantly into this space. And I guess a couple of reflections there. One, it just made a huge contribution to the COVID-19 efforts and the mitigation of the impacts. But second, it demonstrated the agility that I don't think many of us thought we had in this country. The ease with which they pivoted. I'm not saying it was easy, but they literally did it within weeks. Some of these organizations. That was a huge demonstration of the agility, which I think is a really great attribute that we can continue to leverage going forward. I guess the other takeaway was the importance of reliable supply chains that were suddenly disrupted, and the need to pay really close attention to how we have supply chains that can reinforce our competitive position in the economy. So those are some of the really early experiences. And then of course, we got into these much deeper issues of liquidity and the standing up and the evolution of these programs over the course of the pandemic. I could say a bit more about that later in the conversation, but there was no playbook on this stuff, and we've been having to reinvent them as we go, thinking about the need for liquidity, the impact on the labor force, retaining workers, the really critical lens on diversity, and this equally fast pivot to e-commerce, where we've seen an explosion in a number of months, many years worth of technological adoption in a short number of months. So those are all critically important and challenging aspects of the current policy environment.
Okay, thanks. So just I want to open it up to have a few broader questions that you can all chime in on, and also we'll get to audience question and answer in a little while. But I think we've all talked a little bit about some of the supports that are out there, but I think the thing that strikes me is that they keep changing, partly because the pandemic, the pace of the pandemic keeps changing and the patterns keep changing. But those rules and supports seem to be constantly in flux, different across regions, different across industries. Is this affecting the ability of is it helping or is it actually hurting? And is there a better way? I guess I'm wondering who would like to start on that.
Maybe I can take a stab at it,
Sure.
Heather, because I'm the one who's most publicly critical of government on this. And let me start by defending government. The fact is that they've put these programs in a matter of days in many instances, programs that would have taken weeks or even months to design in ordinary times. So it shouldn't be surprising to us to find that in many instances, there are gaps in programs or anomalies that have to be addressed. We're literally designing the aircraft as we're flying in it. And the federal government, to its credit, has come back in a number of instances and fine-tuned programs and improved them. But is it a problem for business? Yes, it is. And more broadly, if we can pull back to 5,000 feet here, what we need is much more coherence in terms of how governments manage the pandemic, how they make rules, how they design programs, and so on. If you look at even at the issue of lockdowns, they vary so much from municipality to municipality in terms of who is able to remain open, who is closed, what sort of enforcement there's going to be. You'll recall even at Thanksgiving, we had a time in Ontario getting a coherent answer about who you could have at your Thanksgiving table. There was so much competing advice on that. We need much more coherence. Information has to be much more widely shared, and where it's possible to have consistency in programs, that would be very helpful as well.
Who else wants to take a stab at that? Like, I'm wondering, how do you get that coherence when there are so many regional variations and levels of government and different? I mean, we've got banks involved in this kind of supplying of support as well.
Yeah, Heather, I'll, if you want me to jump in, a few things I would add to Perrin's point. First of all, also to applaud what governments have done, and that in the main it has helped and helped enormously in many situations. Could it be better? Absolutely. So what do we learn from 2020? Number one, small businesses do not want more debt. There's no interest in borrowing money to get through this crisis, because this crisis has nothing to do with their abilities as a business to function. They are forced to shut down, and therefore it makes no sense to take on debt just to get through. So we need to continue to stress that debt is not an effective mechanism in most business support programs. Secondly, maintaining payroll is really important for a whole bunch of reasons, but the connectivity between employer and employee is really valuable. And employees know this as well. You want people not sort of disconnecting from employers, because reconnecting is not going to happen at the same pace. So we want to keep people on payroll, even in an artificial way as possible. Thirdly, simple works. With household assistance, especially through the spring and summer, programs were oversubscribed. Why? They were simple. They were easy to access and easy for people to understand. Business programs too often were undersubscribed. Why? Because they were complicated. They were hard to access. And we're seeing wrinkles being ironed out. That's very good, and we'll encourage that. But keep it simple. Stupid, if you want to fill out the acronym, it is really important to remember, because we can overthink these programs, often for good reasons, but they have unintended consequences in terms of the take-up. And we may not have a lot of time as we get into winter to worry about take-up. We're going to have to get credit, and not in the form of credit, but get support out the door very quickly and in a targeted fashion. Last point is on these micro challenges. You mentioned municipalities. Yeah, that's a classic Canadian challenge, but we've got to find a way to overcome it. It's just beyond sense that, in a place like Toronto, a barber shop on the south side of Steeles has to close, and on the north side of Steeles can stay open. We all understand why that is, but it's not fair by any measure to the two barbers on and on across the country. So this is a chance, especially for the higher orders of government, to perhaps make certain things happen so that there's greater consistency, especially if this goes on longer than the next few weeks.
Go ahead, Wendy.
There are just two things that I would add, and these are maybe different points. But in my experience, the shift online has actually made it more difficult for many small businesses that don't have the skills, time, or even the wherewithal to figure out where they're going or what they're doing. And if you think about Toronto, where half the population was born outside of Canada, it's amplified. I actually think that there are ways to use old-fashioned job creation mechanisms to help provide humans to support people trying to navigate these processes. And that's why, I don't want to dwell on it, but I think we've got all these young people who are underemployed who could actually be helping. And there was a project with RBC and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, for example, that we assisted with to bring in more diverse applicants for the relief. And, to John's point, lots of people do want micro grants, not loans, but we also got them 40 recent grads, co-op students, and so on, to just be there to help. Because things that may seem really simple to us in terms of filling out forms and so on, often lead people, and we see this with racialized groups, with women and others, to just say, I'm not even going to apply because it's too complicated. So I don't think it's just an issue of fragmentation. I think it's actually an issue of needing help to navigate, wanting someone to walk them through the process. And I think that's a huge opportunity. The other thing I think is an opportunity is to rethink our traditional focus on technology, creating technology and building technology as the driver of innovation. What we've seen with the explosive growth, for example, of Shopify is its adoption. It's adoption of technology that actually drives innovation. You can have all the technology you want. If no one uses it, you got nothing. And I think this is another opportunity to really rethink the innovation agenda in a much more inclusive way, to think about infrastructure, construction, sectors that we historically have kind of ignored because we've been so preoccupied with the Toronto Waterloo tech nexus. So I see some opportunities to both help SMEs and kind of recalibrate some of our strategies to create more opportunities, not less.
Okay, what do you think, Paul? Is there a better way?
Well, maybe just a few comments. So as was noted, the suite of policy responses has really evolved over the months. There's been a lot of retooling as the circumstance has changed, but they have had considerable reach. So the emergency business account, for example, has now hit about 800,000 businesses. It is a loan product, but it's got a sizable forgivable portion on it. The wage subsidy has hit over 350,000 businesses now. So these are fairly sizable programs. The rent subsidy program is still being launched to help with other fixed costs. So those are critical high reach supports, if you will. But there's other work to be done on the demand side. I do take the point. There's more work to be done on what safe economic activity looks like, more partnerships that are possible there. We've had great response from the private sector on the basic health measures of promoting use of masks, physical distancing, hand washing. Probably more we could do on promoting the COVID Alert app, which is an important tool we have at our disposal for battling transmission. And I think just looking forward as we do the rollout of vaccines and so on, what does a safe economic restart look like? So I think there's lots of partnerships there. And as Wendy has noted, how we can look at new models of business that recognize the importance of digital adoption. We were in behind the Main Street model, which I think is a really interesting model. It's a win-win-win solution for all the different partners that are involved in that. So that's an interesting model for sure. And just looking more generally at the diversity programs too. We've set up a program for Black entrepreneurship that we're putting a lot of effort into and working with the partners, and our Women Entrepreneurship program has had a new infusion as well. So trying to stay attuned to both the digital adoption imperatives, the safe economic restart, and the diversity lens.
Heather, I wonder whether I can add a word as well. The conversation's been a good one about the nature of the programs that we have. But the government programs treat the symptoms of the problem. The problem itself is, in fact, the pandemic and the shutting down of our society and of our economy. And we won't get our small businesses won't be functioning properly again. We won't get our economy back in order until such times we have the pandemic under control and that we can start to reopen and resume more of our ordinary lives. The critical thing that is missing today, in my view, is a national strategy, and by this, not federal, national strategy to deal with COVID that is focused on allowing Canadians to regain their normal lives safely, with the emphasis on public health, as rapidly as possible. For the next year, we're going to have to live with this invisible in our midst. We can't be on lockdown that whole time. We can't be simply on subsidy. We are going to have to learn to manage it in the same ways we're managing it with schools, we're managing it in supermarkets and the like, and we can do so successfully more broadly in society. It's only when we can do that we can move away from a subsidies-based economy to one where both families and businesses are able to become self-sufficient again, and where those open for business signs start coming back onto Main Street across Canada.
So that makes me think about, we've got a picture here where we've got a lot of small businesses that are on the brink. Perrin, you talk about a year before things are back to anything resembling open. It's been mentioned a couple of times that women have been particularly sidelined by this crisis. So when we talk about solutions, it seems to me that those solutions have to be almost immediate, because the businesses are on the brink right now, and families are, a lot of them, very much struggling to look after the kids and handling everything at the same time, and schools closing and so forth. We frequently talk about daycare as being the solution to that, but that seems to take an awfully long time. What are the immediate solutions that we can do to help keep women in the workforce, keep them leading these businesses, and make sure that they thrive? Who wants to start with that? John, why don't you start, since your shop has done an awful lot of work on this?
Yeah, we have. Thanks for recognizing that, Heather. I'll point again to this new report, Navigating 2021, because it's got a really interesting, disturbing, but chart about this exact trend and concern. Yes, we need to find a way to build a national childcare strategy in this country, but that will take time and will not help people through the coming months by any measure. So when we talk about these income supports and business supports, it's very important to remember the acute need for many of them for female entrepreneurs as well as female employees. There's a lot of small business owners and operators in this country who have the particular challenges that go with their personal situation or family obligations. So seeing these support programs through that lens is critical. Keeping schools open is really important for this reason, and we have to make sacrifices in some other aspects of society to make that happen. I think most Canadians are willing to do that. But when we look at the shutdown of parts of communities and economic activity in communities, we have to appreciate that a lot of the operations, especially restaurants and retail shops, are run by women who are disproportionately affected. And when you look at the charts in our Navigating 2021, you'll see how this skews towards these sorts of economic activities, retail, hospitality, accommodation, and disproportionately affects people. It's not just women more than men, it's people earning less than $800 a week who have been really clobbered by this crisis, because they tend to be employed in areas that require the gathering of people. I don't know what the economic logic is of it. It's just something we've observed, that things that require people to come together tend to also create a lot of jobs at that lower end of the income scale, which tend to go more to women than men. So without imperiling or jeopardizing or risking public health, as Perrin was saying, there are common rational approaches we can take to helping businesses, especially in large communities like Toronto, where I'm talking to you from today, stay open. Many of those businesses have done incredibly innovative things over the last few months to keep their customers and staff safe. We need to respect that and, in fact, invest in that, because they're going to need that not just in the coming weeks, but in the year ahead. So using that better coordination between governments, all levels of government, maybe using that strength of the higher orders of government as they're rolling out and expanding these programs to help local authorities understand the need to coordinate both health policy and economic policy in a way that not just helps the macroeconomic data that we might talk about, but helps these individual situations, which, as you rightly say, tend to be more women than men, tend to be lower income more than upper income.
Wendy, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I recognize that national childcare is going to take a long time, and I thought, I'm old, so I remember it was actually Charlie Coffey, when he was a VP at RBC, who said that childcare was not a women's issue, it was an economic issue. And I think that was more than 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. I'm from a GM town. We always talk about the multiplier effects of investing in auto jobs, and I'm thrilled that, those investments are being made. But Jim Stanford, formerly from Unifor, came out with a study that showed what the multiplier effects are from investing in childcare. And again, I think if we start to shift some of our thinking about where investments pay off and how they can impact the economy. That's really important. The other thing that for me is critical, and this applies to Indigenous people, it applies to newcomers and women, is we tend to define entrepreneur as owner of an SME with employees. And there are about 114,000 of those that are run by women, but there are a million self-employed women in Canada. And a lot of them are in these services industry sectors, providing personal services, childcare, and so on. And I think there are ways to provide more support to them. Why is it that golf club memberships are tax deductible if you're a small business and childcare is not? Questions like that, I think we start to surface if we really apply a gender and diversity lens to things we've just accepted as the way they are. So even though it may take time to get a national childcare policy in place, I think there are innovative things that we can do right now. I mean, we launched a program for Black families providing free online tutoring because we knew that it was a massive problem. And you can do things with, bubblegum and paper clips if you need to. But I think more systematic approaches to looking at where the problems are and how we can rethink the solutions are critically important right now. And having government willing to take chances on things, they've shown that they could adopt policies and implement programs that historically would have taken months, if not years, to develop. That's one of the things I think was amazing during COVID. I think we can apply that to lots of other things as well.
Okay, Perrin, what do you think is the quick fix here?
I don't think there is a quick fix, but there are things we can do. For example, we could be looking at extending the emergency wage subsidy to in-home childcare to make it easier for women to be able to go back to work. You look at a woman who owns a store who isn't able to get out of the house because she doesn't have access to childcare today. This would be helpful in allowing her to do that. So there are things that we can do to help. But there's no quick fix for any of the element of the problems we're dealing with.
So, Paul, okay, I'm coming back to you again saying, okay, can you do all these things for us, please? But I actually, but I want to flip the question around, actually. For sure, government is trying to think through these things, but talk to me about what the private sector also needs to do. Your turn to throw it back on them.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the solution doesn't lend itself to watertight compartments. It's collaborative action that is absolutely needed. And there's, as we talked about earlier, there's an important sector lens on this downturn where it's hit some sectors, but also segments of society. And I think that's been amply demonstrated, as colleagues have pointed out, women, racialized communities, indigenous businesses. I'm a little closer to the kind of the entrepreneurship side of things and supporting businesses, but I think there is a recognition that there's non-financial issues too. So we do need to think holistically about these other barriers to success. And childcare, I think, has been noted by the government as a key area of action. And there's an action plan for women in economy that was outlined as well. So I think there is an effort to try to connect these dots across government, but it's not going to really have the impact unless it really does have that full collaboration with partners in the private sector and the not-for-profit sector in identifying solutions. Often there are really well-functioning initiatives that are already in place that we need to just identify and scale them up more. And we do a lot of things well, but we often don't do things at scale. So finding these good solutions and what's working and how do we make them more impactful.
I want to turn to some questions that are coming into me from the audience. So the first one is about today's news about the vaccine being approved. And so we should start seeing that rolling out within a few days, slowly but surely, I think. How do you think that this announcement changes things for business? Perrin, why don't we start with you on that? I mean, I think all of a sudden everything comes into focus, right? We have some kind of a little bit more certainty here as we go forward.
It's very good news. It's thank heaven that there's a little bit of sunshine in what's a very bleak period. And it's amazing, Heather, if you think back to the Spanish flu in 1918, imagine if they had the sort of medical treatments that we have today and had the potential for a breakthrough like this, the millions of lives that could have been saved. So this is good news. But it's every indication is that we won't reach the so-called new normal until we reach a vaccination rate of perhaps as high as 70% of the population. That is taking us into the latter half of next year. And that means that we're going to be continuing to live with the disease during that time, which makes then the strategy of a COVID management strategy that much more important. Both responding to this question and to the previous one, another measure we should be putting a big emphasis on is rapid testing. If the goal is to be able to safely reopen, we have rapid testing approved in Canada today. We've got to roll it out. You look at the retail sector, look at restaurants, for example, the confidence people would have if they knew that staff could be tested every day before they started work, or then beauty parlors or barber shops or retail stores and so on. It would boost public confidence considerably. It would allow us to trap diseases that are people who've become who are asymptomatic but who may be spreading, and would protect public health and give much better data as well. All of these things together, there's no one silver bullet, including the vaccine, but all of these things layered on top of each other in a coherent way can allow us to reopen more readily and to get our lives back more quickly and to save lives.
Paul, what about you? How do you see, how does the vaccine bring things into focus for you and to maybe change your approach?
Well, I do think it as parents noted, it lays out a timeline for us to think about safe economic restart. The vaccine rollout is only going to be part of the equation. We can't let up on all these other critically important mitigation measures, that the ones that we've been focusing on for some time: the distancing, the mask wearing, and the personal hand washing. I mentioned the COVID Alert app. Just emphasize that again as another really important tool at our disposal. There is a lot of work being done with the private sector, looking at partnerships on rapid testing, looking at the capabilities to produce the different rapid tests, to deploy them, where we've got partnerships with some innovation labs that are looking at interesting possibilities there that can be scaled up. So it's an active area of examination. I agree that that's part of the equation, and it's about the public sentiments around these things. There's worries about vaccine hesitancy, so that has to be addressed as part of the mix. But consumer confidence is something we need to collectively focus on rebuilding and having safe economic restart.
And John, does the vaccine make you reframe or add a little bit more certainty to your projections for the recovery? Like how does it influence things there?
It speeds up the recovery to a degree, but it is going to be a long grind. There's a lot of scar tissue. Remember, the economy was already long in the tooth heading into 2020. And in some ways, this crisis has accelerated and even masked over some issues that would have kind of worked their way through the economy likely this year as it slowed down naturally. So we're not expecting the economy to get back to pre-pandemic levels until into 2022. So it's wonderful that we're seeing this news. I mean, from a humanitarian perspective, it is wonderful, and it's encouraging from an economic perspective. But let's not assume the lights are going to suddenly turn on across the economy, even in the first 6 months of the year. It's going to take a long time to roll the vaccine out to a critical mass, and that's assuming the levels of efficacy that everyone is kind of building into their assumptions. No reason to doubt that, but we have to remind ourselves of that assumption. And then to deal with the scar tissue, including the number of people. Again, a chart in our publication today illustrates this. Long-term unemployment already is significantly higher than in previous crises and economic downturns. So we've got a significant number of people out there who are already considered long-term unemployed. It is harder for them to get back to work, regardless of the cycle. So it's going to take a while, into 2022, for a lot of those people to get back into the economy when the jobs come back, and jobs tend to trail GDP as well. So let's remind ourselves of that. The other point I'd like to make, Heather, is that we shouldn't lose sight of the digital awakening that this year surely brought to us, and especially for small business that was unfortunately not prepared for this kind of situation when they were forced to deal with customers at a distance and therefore through digital channels. That's not going to reverse itself suddenly because of the vaccine.
Sure.
It was a trend that was a decade underway, was much more advanced in other countries like Korea, but even the United States, and we were slower to accelerate over the last number of years for small business for a bunch of reasons. Let's make sure that the emphasis we've seen in a good way, because we've talked a lot about kind of the darker challenges around us, some good things have happened as well. There's been really good adoption of technologies by small businesses. Let's encourage them to do that more. Let's scale it, I think, as Paul was saying, and ensure that as small business comes out of this crisis, which it will, that it can accelerate, not just on with the tailwind of economic growth, but using new technologies to deal with customers at a scale and with an efficiency and a convenience that they weren't able to do before the pandemic. If I could just share a couple of quick examples of you that we've come across recently. One is a cycle store in Halifax, Cyclesmith, great operation, forced to shut down, is now selling bikes and accessories and parts across the country digitally. Its number 2 market is Ottawa. Number 3 market is Calgary. So the owner of Cyclesmith in Halifax is saying, wait a second, I suddenly have a national business. I don't want to give up on that. I need to keep my local business and continue to grow that national business. There's another entrepreneur who I met through the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce in Saskatoon. She runs a coffee business, Road Coffee, in Saskatoon, forced to shut down. She turned her business into a data company using social media to better understand data around coffee users in Saskatoon, her tribe, and was able to sell to them remotely, but then critically able to use data mining, data analytics to turn that knowledge into insights that allowed her to scale her business through Sobeys, which is now a big business partner for her that she had not thought of before. So there's a great entrepreneur in Canada's full of these extraordinary entrepreneurs who can turn crisis to their advantage. We got to get behind them. Doesn't mean the next few weeks and months are going to be easy, but as we come out of this crisis, and it could be a grind, let's ensure that they're using the technologies that are all around us to accelerate, and not to think that that any of us are going to go back to exactly the way it was, let's say, in 2019.
We're running low on time, and I want to get to the next question here because it's a good one for Wendy. So it's about post-secondary education, and they're wondering if colleges and universities could, I guess, be ramping it up right now, helping to ensure that there's talent and innovation pipelines so that when we get to the other side of this thing, SMEs are able to better survive and come out stronger.
Yeah, I have, I teach entrepreneurship. So obviously I'm committed to supporting entrepreneurships through post-secondary programs. I think, however, that if what we want to do is move quickly, if we want to upskill, reskill, do the things that in my view are most essential, post-secondary institutions are simply not the vehicle for doing that. They do an amazing job at providing people with very solid foundations. I would not trade my degrees in English and history for anything. The management science stuff certainly helped get me where I am. But I think what we need to look at are new models, new partnerships, lots of large corporations have proven how you can upskill and reskill, and we need a platform that will help SMEs do that more readily and to provide more access to micro-credentials and so on. So I think that universities and colleges play a critical role in the recovery and in developing skills and so on. But again, I think this is an area that is ripe for innovation and new models and approaches. And this is somewhere where large companies need to step up, because it's no secret that a lot of large corporations are taking advantage in some respects of COVID to accelerate their adoption of technology to eliminate jobs and reduce costs. And we have seen some pretty scary patterns where sales are going up, but jobs are not. And a lot of that has to do with the acceleration of adoption of technology. We know a lot of big corporations are planning large-scale layoffs. So what is the responsibility of private sector companies to work together with intermediaries, with post-secondary and so on, to come up with new models? So when they're pushing people out the door, they have options, because we know from the research that there are lots of skills that people have. If you take an asset-based approach, you can retool, upskill, and turn someone who worked in the oil patch into someone who can work in an IT company quite easily. You can take someone who was in finance. Oh my goodness, financial skills are such in demand, such a high demand in SMEs. There are lots of really innovative approaches we can take if we think about the system for skills and employment rather than individual interests. And I do think that's one thing COVID has brought us, is an idea that we can work together in very different ways.
Okay, I have 1 minute left, and so what I want you to do is, the government has $100 billion that it wants to spend, up to $100 billion on stimulus. Give me one word each of what you would spend it on for small business. Okay, Perrin, go.
Direct support for small businesses and targeted support for sectors that are hardest hit, such as hospitality and accommodation, restaurants.
That was not one word. Okay, John.
Business.
Digital skills and transformation. 4 words.
Wendy?
Skills.
Okay, you're good. Paul?
I think it's broadly about resilience, but skills are a big part of that.
Okay, there we have the list. Take it back to your boss. Heather Buchan, back to you.
Heather Schofield, thanks very much. That was incredibly enlightening. I would like to thank all of you for the discussion. We have a very esteemed panel today, and I love that we covered off all the areas. I think everybody here should be looking for 21 charts for 21. They need to look up Digital Main Street and how they can activate that. They need to look at some of the private, public, not-for-profit partnerships, government, business, academia. We've had it all. Icing on the cake is Heather Schofield moderating it. So thank you very much. I would also like to thank all of you who joined us virtually. We appreciate your time. We hope that you have some actionable takeaways from today. And the video will be posted online. So if you want to go back and review anything, you can go to the Canadian Club Ottawa website and check it out. I would like to thank, of course, our sponsors. We could not host this event without their support. RBC, Royal Bank, Shaw Communications, Welch LLP, Strategy Corp, and TD Bank. We are so grateful to your support. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we now have a draw. So this is a bit of a fun thing for the last minute or two. You can get free subscriptions to iPolitics for 1 year, 2 people. Heather Schofield, I need you to please pick 2 numbers between 1 and 300. You're on mute.
The suspense. Okay, 98 and 163.
Okay, you're an interesting woman. Those are good numbers. So the people who registered in that, where they are on the roster in terms of registration, please contact our website, CanadianClubOttawa.ca, and just register there, or we will be reaching out to you, more importantly, at Impact Public Affairs. If you get an email from Impact Public Affairs, it's to offer you a free subscription to iPolitics. So 2 of you will be getting that. We've been talking about data analytics here. This is at the core of everything we're doing now in a digital economy. Our next event on January 26th will address that very thing. It's Build Back Better, how data-driven insights can fuel Canada's post-pandemic recovery. We are very, very honored to have a special guest, Canada's chief statistician, Anil Arora. So if you'd like more details on that and to register again, please go to our website, www.canadaclubottawa.ca. Thank you and have a great week and good luck in 2021.